Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 2D of the National Parent Center Conference. This is the second day. We started last week, Tuesday, and now we're in day 2. And this session today is being presented by Sophia Farmer from SciSub Center, and her presentation is on engaging stakeholders on implementation teams. So welcome, Sophia.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'll try to put mine, there we go, so we can see each other a little bit. Hello, I hope you're having a great conference. We'll go ahead and move to the next slide. So today, the hope is that we'll give you a little bit more information about implementation science as a whole and why it's important in parent centers and other organizations, but also how we utilize teams and the role of different stakeholders within those teams, particularly the parent and family voice. And finally, identify a few steps or a process that we use here at NERN and the SciSub Center to engage stakeholders at various levels in our teams. And that is what the handout is that you have all gotten, and hopefully is in or you'll be able to see in the chat box, and I understand that there's a Google Drive as well, where you'll be able to access resources, not to mention the app where the handout is. So if we can go ahead and move forward. So we're going to start with a little bit of the what and why of implementation science. We have a few minutes or the next hour together, and I hope that as we move through our presentation that you will not be shy and engage with me in our work together, okay? So the first is, if you could go to the next slide. So what is implementation science? Implementation science is really about what we do, the practice, the processes, the methods, and the tools that get us from this idea of change or needed change or our goals to the actual use of practices, programs, interventions, and so on. So it's that idea of moving us and using a systemic process from idea or theory or research to the actual use and change. Next slide. So why does implementation matter? What we've known or discovered from over 500 different studies is strong empirical support to the conclusion that the level of implementation itself affects outcomes. So there's a lot of research that is starting to show up in the field that tells us not just does knowing what to do or evidence-based practices matter, but actually how they're implemented and what those processes or methods actually look like and sound like, that matters as well. Next slide. So from the research, we've also learned that just because we know what matters doesn't mean that it is actually getting into schools or into our different organizations that support students and families. Traditionally, we don't adopt practices or practices supported by evidence. When we do adopt them, they're not used with fidelity. When we get them used with fidelity, they're oftentimes not sustained and frequently dropped for the next shiny new practice or program. And then if we do get it used with fidelity and sustained, we find that it isn't used to scale. So how do we make sure that these practices are used in other buildings and their successes are shared? So next slide. When we're talking about implementation, we are talking about, as you'll see, a specific set of methodologies, right, or practices. Because we find that oftentimes either different centers or schools will work towards just sharing information, perhaps even putting in a little training. We want to always start with policy change. We find that happens most often in organizations. We might increase funding. We might even reorganize. But what we know now is that these strategies are necessary but insufficient when used alone. These are part of a larger structure or formula for implementation success. Next slide. And that formula contains these 3 factors. And within each factor, there are different frameworks that we pay attention to in implementation. So the first factor is effective practices. And this is the one schools and organizations are most familiar with. These are the evidence-based or research-based practices. You might have seen them referred to as high leverage practices that are used in education. And when we develop those practices, we need to make sure that they're usable. So we call them usable innovations. And that means that they're clearly defined. They have a certain philosophy behind them. Each of the components of that innovation or practice are operationalized for use. And finally, there's some sort of fidelity tool or measure that goes with the practices. The next factor in effective implementation is the how we do it, or the effective implementation part. And those are comprised of 2 different frameworks that we talk about in implementation science work. The first is using a stage-based approach, meaning that when we start from that first idea that something needs to change, all the way to getting it fully implemented, there are different stages or phases in that work, starting with exploration, moving to installing, and then initial and full implementation. Additionally, in each of those stages, there are the building blocks or the key or core components of the work of implementation, and those we call drivers. And those drivers are around things like building competency through coaching or training and selection of staff, or to the organizational drivers like using data to drive decisions, or the importance of roles of leadership and leadership teams. Which brings us to the third factor, which is how do we build the context or hospitable environments in order for these new practices to be fully realized? And we do that through 2 other frameworks, or the description of 2 other frameworks. The first being teams, which we're going to really spend the majority of our time around today, and then improvement cycles. So these teams are engaged in continuous improvement cycles to make sure that we get closer and closer until we realize the outcomes we intend. So if you could advance to the next slide, here's where I hope you'll play with me a little bit in this presentation. Next slide. So what is your experience? Implementation of new initiatives is hard and takes time. It takes a long time for schools and organizations to get new things in place. Can you share? You can either come off mute, or if you'd like to put it in the chat box, so I'd really love to hear your voices. Share an example of a time that you were successful in implementation efforts, and if you can name something that perhaps made it successful. And I like to warn people, I was a former special educator, so my wait time is pretty good.
Yes, please use the chat box to respond.
You could.
Sophia. I can unmute people too, but I don't know if they can unmute themselves. I'm not sure, but use it the chat box or
either one.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, you see it, right? Okay.
I do. We have one person that said that she developed a special education parent advisory group in the school district. Excellent. Typically we switched to a new home study format, which enabled us to vet foster parents better. That's great. 2 great examples. Usually that folks tell us that what makes those types of efforts successful are things like the teaming structures they developed, or like as would be inherent in an advisory group, making sure that we have representative voices, right? Or I see the word format there, so home study format. So things like developing particular tools or a particular protocol is very helpful to successful implementation. It gives us something to go back to and reference so that we're consistent over time. Okay. All right, so next slide. So we said we would spend a lot of time on implementation teams. So what is a team? Next slide. Next slide, please. There you go. And then you can go ahead and click through there. There's a pop-up that comes. So a group of stakeholders, a team, when we're talking about teams, is a group of stakeholders that oversees or attends to or is accountable to key functions. And those key functions are selection, implementation, and improvement, okay? When we talk about teams of stakeholders, it's not just an advisory board, though part of their role could be advising. It is not just a group that provides just periodic input or meets for emergencies. It's not just a group for learning or a collaborative. It is those things plus attending to the actual implementation with those that we hope will benefit from the particular program or practice we're selecting. And we know teams are pivotal. So next slide. And you can go ahead and click through. So in different studies of implementation teams versus no implementation teams, we've discovered a few things. When we don't have an implementation team, we refer that to just kind of letting it happen, right? And hoping for the best. If you can keep clicking. There's some animation on here. So, and then when we have an implementation team, we refer to that as our specific actions with a team that's accountable for making it happen. And the difference in those two scenarios is quite extreme in that the teams that let it happen, what we've realized is that only 14%, and you can click again, only 14% of sites over 17 years of implementation ever got to full implementation. 14%, that's a really small number. As opposed to the next one, if you go ahead and click, putting you to work, keep going. As opposed to 80% of sites that got to full implementation in only 3 years. So that's how important or critical the work is of collaborative teaming structures. So it's really important that we get these teams right. They are so pivotal to implementation. We want to make sure that we get these teams right. So next slide. So what does that mean? That means we want to have a small team. Small team doesn't mean we just want to keep it with a small group of folks or limit who has access. Small team means that we have a team small enough to get the work done, but large enough to disrupt the system, if you will. So large enough to have that diversity of perspective that you see in the next bullet, and large enough to have an impact on the system or the group or the school or the district or the organization that we're trying to change. So small enough to get the work done without there being too many cooks in the kitchen, if you will, but large enough to really give us that diversity of perspective. We also want to make sure that this team is guided by a team charter, if you will. Oftentimes teams will call this things like norms or roles and responsibilities establishment. We kind of put those together in one document in the implementation science world and call those our team charter, or how we're going to agree to work together. This is particularly important when we're talking about children and family organizations, because we want to make sure that we really pay attention to issues of confidentiality and making sure that those who are working with us feel safe enough to give us, say, honest opinions, because we're going to be talking about implementation issues and how we really make things better for kids and families. And we also want to make sure that our team participates in shared decision making. In other words, we spend a lot of time working with teams on that collaborative or shared leadership and decision making. We do not, even when we approach this in schools and have principals or district leaders on the team, we actively ask them to take a step back and allow their teacher leaders, parents, sometimes students, especially in the older grades, really get involved in this team building and shared decision making, and so that we can hear those perspectives and make sure that we're accounting for all aspects in implementation. So next slide. So what do? They do things like communicating with a broader range of stakeholders. One of their most important jobs is communicating with other teams that may have parallel or linked work to theirs. We do a lot of planning together in these teams. We do problem solving. We also do a lot of training and coaching. And there's training and coaching on different levels. So there's training and coaching on the practice or program or initiative that we're putting forth, but there's also a lot of training and coaching on how to participate in teams, make sure you have the information you need to participate effectively in teams, make sure everyone's informed or understands their role as advocates for their particular perspective. So really understanding that our teams and our team members are well poised to be the problem solvers and planners and data analysts we need them to be. So to that end, we have them collecting data and analyzing and studying data from an ongoing problem solving and progress monitoring approach. So next slide, this is your chance again. Remember, if you click on participants, you can ask to unmute and Miriam will unmute you, or you can just put in the chat box. Either one is totally fine, but tell me again about your experience. If you participate on various teams, when teams are functioning well, what stands out to you? What makes a team hum, if you will? Collaboration, absolutely. Productivity, oh yes. Don't you hate going to those meetings where it's just like report outs? Shared agreement on outcomes, yes. Having a vision and knowing where we're going and what the point is of us being there. Participation, diversity, holding each other accountable, loved that one. Love that one. How do we hold each other accountable in a critical friends kind of way? That's a education-ese, I suppose, but holding each other accountable. And I like the next one, conflict, but productive conflict that moves us forward, right? Having those crucial conversations that make us think harder and create a little dissonance for us, right? Because otherwise we're not changing. Good debate, team members who are prepared. Yes. Absolutely. Great answers. All right, so next one, diversity, that's come up a lot, which is exactly, so next slide, exactly where we are. You're absolutely right. The diversity that we're talking about is our diversity in perspectives, our diversity in training and expertise, in our lived experiences, in the relationships we have, and in our priorities. So we really want to make sure that we have this understanding of equitable contribution from not just leaders, but families, consumers, beneficiaries, other agencies and service providers, contextually and other contextually relevant members. And it's really clear, and when we go into schools, when we go into districts, when we go into other organizations, that if we are working to find a solution to a stated need, that we have the folks on the ground, the people that are impacted by these decisions, who have a voice in helping us solve the problem. You guys know this, right? But when we work into schools, we ask them, if you're not going to have students at the table, if you're not going to have families at the table, which we hope is not an option, but how are you soliciting advice from true problem solving, not just information giving, not just dissemination, but true problem solving expertise in this work, and not just from the families or students that always participate. So how do we actively solicit the voice of parents that maybe don't have great experiences with schools, or or students who aren't always successful in schools. We actually just worked on this with a school in Virginia where students were really struggling, students with disabilities were really struggling with math at the high school level, and had students on our team who actively problem solved with us around what were some of the barriers or difficulties that they were finding with math, and were able to have some pretty honest, as only teenagers can do, conversations with the adults in their lives about needing greater engagement and what that looked like for them, and the differences in what engagement meant to them versus what engagement meant to the adults that they were working with in their classroom. And that was a critical conversation for them, because without it, the teachers might have planned entirely different types of engagement strategies, as an example. So if you'll keep going. So what we've realized in our work over time is that team membership shifts, and that's okay. And that's why when I said we spend a lot of time on training and coaching, not just on the practices we're putting in place, but how to function as teams together, that we do that so that people can have or understand that the differing roles on teams, so that when that team membership does shift or change over time, we have capacity. We don't have any gaps in our team. We also sometimes intentionally plan for rolling memberships of teams, depending on what they are. Also to that end, communication is certainly necessary. Allocation of time and job descriptions if we want work done. You know, we always say we prioritize, where our priorities are based on where we spend our time, right? So making sure people have time to work in teams and collaboratively work together. And so to do that, we really need sponsors or champions of systems change. And then again, going back to that selection of tough to teach traits or coaching and training around them, so that we make sure we have people at the table that can really support the change. And so to that end, next slide. NERN and SISIP have particular tools or resources for doing that way of work. So you'll see a link there, and then we'll provide you with a specific tool. It was in the chat box earlier, but it's also posted with the materials from the sessions. This is one particular tool around what we call our terms of reference or team charter. And this is where we encourage teams to document essentially their way of work. So what those specific goals are, who are the people on their team and roles and responsibilities, outline that communication. So this is one particular link to that type of work. So if you'll click to the next slide. This is just a reflection as we move forward on what is your experience. When you've been part of those great teams, and I saw some of you already put in diverse viewpoints, do they have diversity in perspectives, in their positions, in their competencies? Do the teams that you work with have structured leadership to guide the ongoing work and function of the team? And again, we talked about not a leader, but leadership that is shared, that helps to guide and structure the ongoing work and function of the team. And that's really critical, because we find if you have a designated leader, separate from, say, a facilitator, which we all need, if that the team tends to defer to the knowledge of that leader without some intentional shared or collaborative leadership or leadership building going on in the team. And that you spend the time to make those working agreements on how we're going to function together. I usually, when I work with teams, not usually, we sometimes get the collective eye roll when we talk about developing norms and really outlining those roles and responsibilities. But what we found is we either pay now, meaning spend the time up front developing those, or pay later, right? Because we run into barriers to our functioning together as a group. Okay, so I won't ask you to tell stories out of class, as the saying goes, but either in the chat box or ask to unmute yourself. What is one thing you'd like to see your team do differently related to the formation and functioning of your teams. And I won't know. So.
If you like to be unmuted, type your name on the chat box and I will unmute you.
Would you like to see things like more diversity, more shared leadership? Would you like to go back and develop that kind of team charter, if you will? What is something you'd like to see differently on your teams? And you don't have to tell me what team. Ah, yes. Respect for the various roles. More input from families. Absolutely. And I would expand, yes, more families. I would expand that to families, students, other community stakeholders that are really impacted by the decisions we make in schools. I don't think we spend, of course, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but enough time really really asking not just how do we think kids are doing, but how we understand their perspective on it. Is this easy or hard for kids and families? Tell me about how you might feel more comfortable participating. Those types of questions as well. Engagement, diversity, yeah, and community stakeholders. Any others? Okay. So related to that, I'll ask, there seems to be several comments related on more input from families and or that the input that we get is more diversified, meaning we have a greater variety of perspectives. So from your experiences, what are some action items you've taken that we can share with our colleagues around getting that diversity of perspectives? What's been successful? How do we go about doing that? Or is there something you saw at a different time in the conference that gave you some ideas for that? For gaining that larger perspective or getting more engagement that's authentic from families we don't typically hear from. A successful strategy. Again, you can either ask to be unmuted, put your name in the chat box, or just write it in the chat box. Continue advocacy for the need. Absolutely. Oh, I love this one. Various outreach strategies by phone, text, messaging, email, social media to gather input. I try to use social media as well. Ask a question, throw a question out and try to see what I get back in terms of responses. Multiple ways of gathering information from forums in different languages, surveys, opportunities to call and give feedback. We ask at every event we attend for feedback on the way we do our work. Absolutely. I have worked in schools, voice and choice. I have worked in schools in Virginia for all of my career, actually, in different capacities. And I was just going to say that, Beverly, go to where families gather. I was actually just going to say that. Two of my most effective principals in two different cities in Virginia where I worked they were masters at this. They went not just to school functions, they went to community events, and they would put out on social media or texting or word of mouth where they were going to be. We had one that would like any social events, the fairs, right? The county fairs he would be at, and he would, network like I had never seen. He would go to barbershops. He would also go to different barbershops in the community and get input as well. And then I had another one who had who as his side hustle, as they say, as my kids tell me, community-based organizations as his side hustle. He liked to be a guest, either lecturer or preacher. He was a deacon in his church. And so he would ask and go to different churches in the community and have that experience. And both of these men were just masters at getting input from families. And as such, because he took that time to go with them and build that relationship and really hear them, he got much more participation and collaboration from families and even community members, different business organizations to support the schoolwork. So great idea. Serve families to reach diverse and more families. Great, thank you. Okay, so we'll keep going. Next slide. So here's where we're going to spend the rest of our time together. And it's on really how we have really operationalized different ways in which we engage stakeholders. Next slide. So the first thing that we try to do when we're focusing on our implementation efforts in whether it's at the state level or district, region, school, or even working with different nonprofits, we talk to them about the different levels of stakeholder engagement. Unfortunately, so if you look at this model in particular, what we find unfortunately, is that most levels of engagement that we see are at the bottom end of this triangle. This is typical, right? So we're informing of the work, we're informing them what's going on, we're doing a lot of telling and dissemination. We're not even really doing a great job of helping stakeholders find the information. We're just putting it out there, right? So on websites, it could just be posting on social media without any expectation of collaboration. But we're really just informing of the work. The next level is really talking about consulting in the work. So we're asked to provide some type of feedback, right? And usually that feedback is very structured. So we have particular questions and they provide a particular response. So that could be in the form of surveys. It could even be, again, through either websites or social medias, paper pencil surveys. But again, the responses are very structured and tailored to particular pieces of information that we're looking to find. As we move up the triangle, now we're starting to get a little more input. So the next part, or the next layer of effort, if you will, is that we have stakeholders that are involved in the work, right? So they might help us get the different perspectives. They might present different solutions or options to something that we're working on. They might identify more information for us that we may need or have solicited. But the key here is at this point still, they are not actually involved in the decision-making of the work. We're still we're getting more information from them than a consult, but we're not still at this point engaged in that side-by-side decision-making that we would like to see. As we keep moving up the strategy in the stakeholder engagement strategies, we start then to looking at collaboration and co-creation, okay? Both of them really involve that side-by-side decision-making. The difference in the two is that when we co-create, we start to shift the leadership to that shared leadership construct that we're talking about, but the shared leadership isn't just with the engaging organization, right? So that shared leadership isn't just the school giving it, if you will, right? Or the organization giving it. So when we shift from collaboration to co-creation, the team members or stakeholders are, one, actively invited and engaged with the role, their role being that you will not only help make decisions, but set the course for this work, and that your role and responsibility and position in this work is shared, right? And there's the expectation of that shared dialogue. Additionally, the difference between collaboration and co-creation is a concerted effort at the co-creation level to make sure we hear from voices that we typically don't hear from and who are explicitly impacted by the work that we're doing, okay? So we could have stakeholders on our team that collaborate with us. They do share in decision making. They do share in that side-by-side work and co-learning. But again, they're more invited in, here's your responsibility, help us get this done. Whereas co-creation is, we need someone that will help lead this work with us and is directly impacted and isn't typically part of the conversations that we're having, so we can make sure. And this is how we try to get to more equitable participation and voice, right? The caveat to this is that in these levels, right, of effort, is not that there's some that are bad or good. It's that there's different layers of that engagement depending on the outcome and when we need to use different types of engagement. So for example, we might stay at Inform if we've already co-created something new or implementation aspects for a new practice and have some successes to share, and we're going to inform a broader stakeholder group. Okay, so it's not that informing is always bad, it's that it has a time and a place, and that is not, shouldn't be the only engaging way we engage stakeholders or families in our work. So just wanted to make that distinction. I also wanted to just say, in our crazy time that we're living in right now, we recognize that that's harder and harder to do, but that doesn't mean we're not going to do it. What it means is, even though it's harder to do in the time of COVID and different political unrest or concerns, and social distancing and more going to hybrid or virtual formats, doesn't mean that we have the luxury, if you will, of skipping the co-creation process or collaboration process, but that we be really much more intentional about how we make it happen in a way that feels safe and comfortable, and helps mitigate some of the disparities that we're seeing in either technology access or so on. So I hope that makes sense. And so how do we do that? How do we go about? So the next slide. Okay. The next slide you'll see is just the front and back of maybe page 2 or 3 of the handouts, where we really talk about, okay, now that we know the different types of engagement that we may or may not need within a particular implementation process, how do we go about determining how we're going to make that happen in a way, just like with other aspects of implementation, that is very thought out and planned and not left to chance? These conversations happen in the teams that we start to build, that we talked about earlier, making sure that the variety of perspectives are included, but also that this is a question that continues to come up as we move through the implementation work. So the first part of this, you'll see the different colors. So we're going to ask clear key questions to help us understand not only who, but how we're going to get either student, family, or other stakeholder engagement. And then the second part is really that action planning to help us stay accountable. So next slide. So there are 4 key components. The first is to identify. The second is analyze. The third is map. And the fourth is plan. Next slide. So the first thing we're going to do is identify. So we're going to start with a very clear direction or purpose for our change. Okay. Then we need to facilitate a conversation with the group that benefits from this change, or the group that will be actively implementing the change, as to what that clear direction and purpose is and who we might need. Okay. So we start with identification. Who will contribute to that objective, that need for change? Who will benefit by it? Who will be affected by it? Who will be affected by it, but we're also going to have to work a little harder to get them to the table because they're not often included. And then who can influence this change directly or indirectly? So we need to spend some time really clearly identifying the change. It cannot be just kind of a, we want to do better, right? Or we want kids to do better in school. We want to be very specific about the type of change or how we want kids to do better so that we know whose voices are really needed. So that's why we ask not just who can benefit from it, but we want to know specifically who can benefit. Is there a particular population of students or a particular population of families? Who will contribute to this? So again, getting specific so we make sure we have the key expertise on our team, the different layers of voice, but also who has influence. Oftentimes our teams will forget who has the influence and they get stuck, right? Because they don't have either the social capital, the policy influence, the leadership influence to actually make the change. So we need to make sure we have those influential members on the team who can help us act on the decisions we make. So we're going to specifically outline what these roles are of these folks and then name them. So in a state, just as an example, in a state that I'm currently working on, their role, their key opportunity for change is for K-3 students, English language arts, in particular students with disabilities across the spectrum. So whether they're actual learning disabilities or also emotional behavioral disabilities. Really looking at whose voice needs to be at the table for this. As such, that they have invited different stakeholders within their Department of Education, from special educators to literacy to instructional personnel. They've invited their McKinney-Vento specialist and homeless education. They've invited their federal programs person, and then really starting to look at which now they're in a place now where they're looking at, now that we've got our department folks, which family group are we going to start to work towards needing that input from, and at what level? So they're really starting to think about who can help us as parent advocates or parent center groups that can help us make these decisions around literacy. Particularly now, because they want to heighten focus. When they did their root cause analysis, they wanted to heighten focus on how we can help families support students in this hybrid universe that we're living in right now, which may or may not either continue or continue in cycles as we move forward. So after we identify, we go to analyze. So if you'll go to the next slide. We go to analyze. And there's two key questions that we ask about in the analysis phase of planning this out. The first is, how were they affected and what will we need from them? So how were they affected? Meaning, are they the beneficiaries of this? Are they going to help deliver the practice or program? Are they community members? So how does this particular change affect how they interact with the change agents, if you will, or the implementers? And the second is, what do we need from them? And that's just a very basic way of saying, if we look at that triangle, what do I need from this particular group to be able to do? So am I just going to need quick information from them? Am I going to need help leveraging other resources? What is it that I'm starting to think that I'm going to need or need support with or need to engage around? So next slide. So when we ask that question, typically we have different stakeholders that we need different things from, right? So it's not just a one-size-fits-all stakeholder engagement group. I do have another state that we're trying to move from that model, that we don't start with a stakeholder engagement group and check, say that we're done getting stakeholder input. We look first at we analyze what is it that we need to do, what is the needed change and where we need to go. And now for each of those folks that we want to engage of stakeholders or groups of folks, what is the appropriate level of engagement? So that's really taking out that pyramid that we did earlier and saying to the group, okay, let's take some time to figure out how we do this. So is it that for this particular group, we're just informing? Is it for this other group or focus group of folks that we're really going to collaborate with? Is it that we need a set of families or students who will actually do some co-creation with us and do some work with us? So really talking about considering that pyramid, who do we need for what and how? So this is where we really start to map it, and you'll see on column 4 of that other side of the handout where we really start to be mindful of what our outcomes are, starting with that end in mind and planning the engagement from there. And then finally, that takes us to planning. Absolutely. So planning that engagement. If you'll go to the next slide, sorry about that. There we go. And really planning what that engagement looks like, and not just planning who's responsible for letting people know or who's going to send out the survey, but also to that key question at the top, what are the barriers and enablers of that engagement? What does that look like? What are we going to need to do to make sure that we have equitable participants in this work? That what is going to make it easier for our stakeholders to spend their time with us, to engage in that hard problem-solving change work of that. So the next thing we're going to do is really reflect on these 4 steps. And for this part, if you go on to the next slide, I hope you'll ask a lot of questions. I was hoping to use this time together, this next part of our time, to take some actions or really take each section. So you might need the handout, or we might actually could go to back to slide 23 and take each section in turn and get some ideas for how we can support each other in the work. So it's the slide, Rosalind, with identify, analyze, with all 4 circles on it. There you go, that one. Okay, so that was a lot of information in a short period of time around each of the 4 components. So I was hoping that we could spend this time together to really action plan or get some ideas from each other, again, either by asking to unmute or putting in the chat box, putting your name in the chat box to unmute, and really talk about what are some next steps we could do for each of these 4 components. Some sharing of some strategies and ways we could support each other in this work. So remembering that the first is identify. How do we go about, as colleagues, identifying different stakeholders or different stakeholder groups? The structure or the model that we presented gives you an idea of some key questions to ask, but how do you actually go about identifying your groups? What are some ideas you have? Grant goals, good one. Funders always want to know you're following through. Current partners help us decide that. Existing outreach plans? Sure. The question is, how do we go about, or what are some strategies for doing the identification phase of this process, or identifying various stakeholders? In particular, I'm interested in, for selfish reasons, when we work with districts and schools, how they're always asking us, what are ways that we can select and encourage new folks to the table, or folks that we don't typically hear from? And so I'm hearing from Beverly, I think you need to make sure your agency has the right reputation as the one who brings people together and does good work and follows through. Absolutely. Relationships, right? Michelle, engage new corporate and foundation partners to help build a diversified funding stream to support. Yes, exactly. Identifying what the needs are again, that goes back to really identifying and being clear and specific around what those needs are. Absolutely. Again, any strategies for really pulling in those families and students or folks that are really kind of done with us at the school level sometimes? Absolutely. Creating the culture from the outset where families feel accepted. Exactly. They're not going to just come in because we asked or need something. We have to take that time to build that culture. Sometimes pairing with other events like student art shows or activities. Yeah. Flexible times. Absolutely. I know that's so hard, but yes. Survey your stakeholders to identify needs. Listen. That's right. Okay. Give multiple opportunities and methods. Exactly. Conveying why, Beverly, that is exactly right. A lot of times parents don't understand, particularly ones that don't have the best of relationships with us, about why their participation matters and what we're hoping to get from their involvement, and really why their voice is important to our work moving forward. Commit to sharing outcomes with them. Data sharing. And in fact, there's some studies out that say if we can share data with stakeholders within the first 6 months, it leads to greater momentum and buy-in and readiness. Nominating parent reps on these teams and recognizing their expertise as parents. Love it. And you know what I love about that idea, and sometimes we really work with districts and schools on, is this notion that that parents and families are ongoing contributing decision makers to their teams, and not just we need to know what you think about, right? Okay. So let's think about the next one, which is analyze. So our next circle, which we really talked about, providing language support. That's another great one. We talked about in the analyze section, understanding, and this gets to what Beverly said about conveying why their participation matters, and what we need. So this idea of how are they affected and what will we need from them, right? So really providing maybe the language support to get that messaging through, or really understanding what types of contribution on that engagement triangle that we need. The third one, because we already really approached that, the analyze work in our identify as well, is the mapping. So what are ways you guys decide or encourage, because I would hazard a guess that you and your work are more about encouraging different levels of stakeholder engagement or support higher up that more collaborative and co-creation. What are ways that you help other organizations or parents even advocate for greater involvement? So that map section where we're mapping, what are ways that either you advocate for greater co-creation or collaboration, or help different organizations such as schools or districts or regions or nonprofits map their stakeholder engagement? So really a twofold question. Okay, so some clarity on mapping. So when we talk about mapping, remember that's the part where we talk about not just naming stakeholders for the purpose of it being a set or standard stakeholder group, if you will, or the set or standard, here's my parent rep on my team, but really taking the time to understand the objectives or roles of different roles and responsibilities of different people on the team, including external or community stakeholders, and mapping their layers of involvement. So whether that's co-creation, whether this person serves the role of communicating or informing other stakeholders, whether they whether they come in as or in the role of generating ideas or consulting. Maybe we invite in stakeholders for consulting. So taking that triangle that we talked about, or different or however you envision, or your schema for that different levels of engagement, how do you take that and either, the question is two-part, either encourage parents or families to be involved in one of those layers and how to advocate as such for them or with them, or two, how do you in your role understand or get the organizations to understand how to do that type of mapping? So one option is to specify what particular topic will be discussed exactly. And sometimes the stakeholders will say, I feel more, they'll tell us kind of what their role is. You know, this is a particular area of expertise or passion for me. I really feel like I could help, you know, make some decisions around change. But I only have the time to consult. So sometimes if we specify the particular topic, they'll help us map, absolutely. Oh, love this. So they support schools, so thank you, Jane, by offering various levels of opportunities. A training, so that would be informed, to develop outreach planning teams to interact with the families, made up of families, to help get greater involvement and gather what they want to be trained on, and also developing advisory councils that have layers, absolutely. So how do we train or inform and then really get them to problem solve around those greater levels of involvement? Any other ideas? All right, then Rosalind, if we could go down to slide 29, we'll finish up with, so it's the picture. One more, there you go. So we'll finish up with a couple of things. One with really hoping this has been helpful in how we use the implementation science process for that very defined methods and tools for engaging not just stakeholders in general, but different types of stakeholders and for different purposes, and leave a few minutes of time. We have, I always like to try in the day where we are on a lot of Zoom meetings or time that we're in a lot of Zoom meetings, let you have a little breather between sessions, but also I did want to leave a time because that's a lot of information in just a short period of time for some questions. Again, either to unmute or put a question in a chat box. Or just share a brilliant aha or idea you had. All right, well then if there are no questions, you can get great tips for stakeholder engagement. That's great. So on the next slide, Rosalind, if you would like just more information about implementation science in general, or search the site for stakeholder engagement or involvement, that's the link to what we call the Active Implementation Hub. We are always updating it with either briefs or how-tos, videos, lessons, tools for using implementation science to ensure that we move from that research to practice to student benefit continuum. We move down that continuum. So I hope that you will check it out, and you could always email the center for support or more trainings. And yes, they are all free access. Absolutely. All of, most of our work, the majority of our work, yes, definitely is all funded either by OSAP or different education grants. So they are all free access. You can take them and use them with your teams as well. We do not have the translation. So there's a question about, can these be translated? We do not have translations up on the site at this time. No, that's a real weakness of ours. Yes, you can do it if you want. Yes, they are all free. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Sophia. It has been a very rich information that you have presented.
Oh, thank you for letting me come and talk.
And connecting the dots with all the theory and the practice.
Yes, great. Well, if there's nothing else, you guys have a great rest of your conference.